order. Welcome to meeting number 33, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 sub 3, the committee is meeting to continue its study of Bill C-25, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act, and to enact an act to change the names of certain electoral districts 2026. Today's meeting is taking place in public in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person and in the room remotely using Zoom. Before I continued, I'd ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table in front of you. It's to help prevent audio feedback incidents for the health and safety of everyone here, especially our interpreters. Reminder, all comments should be addressed through the chair. If you wish to speak, raise your hand here or on Zoom, please. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for today's first panel. Welcome back from the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, Stéphane Perreault, the Chief Electoral Officer, and Trevor Knight, General Counsel. From the Office of Commissioner of Canada Elections, Caroline Simard, Commissioner, Michael Bisson, Deputy Commissioner Operations, and Chantal Richard, Executive Director and Senior General Counsel. The CEO and Commissioner each have 5 minutes. The floor is yours, Monsieur Perreault.
Alors, merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner l'occasion.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for this opportunity to speak with the committee today about Bill C-25. The bill introduces a number of changes to strengthen the security and integrity of the electoral process in response to foreign interference and other emerging threats. So from the outset, I'd like to express my general support for this bill. However, as Chief Electoral Officer, it is my role to inform the committee of areas where the bill could be improved. For the most part, Bill C-25 reflects the recommendations that I made in my 2024 report, Protecting Against Threats to the Electoral Process, which came about in the context of the Foreign Interference Commission, as well as the work of this PROC committee. This includes changes to prevent foreign funding of third parties, rules to prevent the use of non-traceable instruments for making contributions, as well as the expansion of a number of offenses such as bribery and intimidation related to nomination and leadership contests. It also extends the application of the rules against undue influence by foreigners beyond the electoral period and includes nomination and leadership contests. Bill C-25 adds new rules and improves existing ones to protect the information environment. In particular, it includes measures that will help address the growing problem of deepfakes that can be used to mislead electors, something for which I have strongly advocated. It also introduces changes to address problems related to unduly long ballots, which are also aligned with recommendations I made to the Minister and to this committee. I would note that the rule against electors signing multiple nomination papers is carefully crafted to ensure that a candidate's nomination will not be jeopardized because a person may also have signed someone else's nomination.
Just proposing this bill, I also believe that there are areas where it can be improved or should go further. I am particularly concerned about changes in the information environment and their impact on our electoral democracy. The Foreign Interference Commission stated that this information is the biggest threat to our democracy, and I share that view. Bill C-25 proposes an offence for publishing information about the electoral process that the person knows to be false with the goal of interfering with the vote. I note that there already exists prohibitions to a similar effect in the Canada Elections Act that have been used successfully to prosecute offenders. What is not addressed by this bill is a situation where inaccurate information about the electoral process is published with the goal of undermining trust in the election or its results. For example, altered videos purporting to show stolen or destroyed ballots. Such behavior supporting false claims that an election may have been stolen has nothing to do with criticism of the process or criticism of its administration. The standard for such an offence should be high, as I have proposed, but I do believe that a line must be drawn to protect our democracy against deliberate acts of destabilization. In contrast, criticism of the process or of its administration is a normal part of democratic debate and should be tolerated even though its premise may be factually false or even if it is made by conveying falsehoods. It is fundamentally distinct from attempts to overturn an election or undermine its results through the deliberate publication of false narratives. I would also like to see a requirement for transparency markers whenever electoral communications involve synthetic content generated using artificial intelligence. While there are perfectly valid reasons for the use of such content, the potential for deception is such that electors should be informed of its use. I note that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage recently made a recommendation requiring that all fully synthetic AI-generated content be clearly identified as such through standardized labeling mechanisms that are visible and understandable to the public. Mr. Chair, given the time constraints, I have shared with the committee a table that includes these and other suggested improvements, which I would be happy to discuss. These concerns only issues that are directly addressed in the bill and not other recommendations found in my November 2024 report. I would also like to offer the availability of my officials as the committee reviews the bill. This is a customary practice that I believe members have found to be useful in the past. So thank you for inviting me today, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Madame Simon.
Alors, merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner.
Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to appear before you today. I'm joined by Mick Bisson, Deputy Commissioner, Operations, and also by Chantal Richard, Executive Director and Senior General Counsel. Bill C-25 proposes significant changes that will directly affect my office. It grants important new investigative tools and powers that are essential to fulfilling our mandate effectively. Overall, the bill closes several key compliance and enforcement gaps in the Canada Elections Act and strengthens the existing enforcement framework.
A few areas where the bill could be improved. First, regarding the privacy regime for political parties, a single set of rules set out directly in the Act and applicable to all parties should be adopted rather than having to enforce multiple party-specific policies. This would ensure consistency among political parties and a unified approach to enforcement. The documents held by political parties, candidates, and electoral district associations should also be subject to a mandatory retention period and should be provided to my office upon request. Otherwise, we may face challenges getting the evidence to conduct our investigations. In addition, political parties should be required to report privacy breaches to my office so I may decide to launch investigations if circumstances warrant it. Second, I would like to raise a concern regarding the proposed option to destroy crypto contributions. This could result in the loss of important evidence and impede investigations. It would be preferable to remove this option and instead require that such contributions be returned unused or converted to money and returned to the receiver general. My office has long relied on the Act's well-established penal regime, which remains a critical enforcement tool. While the EMS regime is comparatively recent and still evolving, Bill C-25 makes a meaningful contribution to its continued maturation. These changes will support stronger compliance outcomes by providing my office with greater agility. We will indeed have an improved access to timely information and the ability to act across a broader range of circumstances, both during and outside pre-election and election periods. This is important given that issues such as foreign interference and disinformation may occur at any time. Taken together, Bill C-25 represents a meaningful expansion of my office's mandate and further solidifies Canada's position as a world leader in electoral compliance and enforcement. And we will continue to ensure that we have the people, expertise, and processes in place to implement any new powers. I would be pleased to answer the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll go to Mr. Cooper first for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Perreault. The government incorporated in this bill your recommendations around amendments to the Canada Elections Act to require third parties to use funds exclusively from individual Canadian contributors for regulated pre-election and election activities, subject to an exception where they could still use their own funds provided that contributions to the third party in the year prior to the pre-election period were 10% or less of the third party's revenue. For third parties where this exception would apply, would they be bound by the same requirements as third parties not captured by the exception with respect to contributions, specifically to the extent that a third party, subject to the exception, used contributions for regulated activities? Would those contributions only be allowed to come from individual Canadians?
They would be contributions coming from their own revenue, whatever that source may be, and that would commingle with other funds. So in practice, in the law, they are not allowed to use foreign funds in order to conduct or support its regulated activities. But of course, in practice, there may be some commingling of funds where it's difficult to determine where the money comes from.
So, for example, if in the year prior to the previous year, there was a foreign contribution to the third party, those funds would effectively be melded and treated as part of the revenue of the third party. Is that accurate?
In principle, they should not use foreign funds. The same is true of individuals who are not caught by the requirement of a separate fundraising source, and they may have revenue of different sources. And so that challenge is true there as well, that the practical challenge.
Practical challenge would be that monies could be funneled or directed to third parties, just as they could be today. And for third parties that are subject to the exception, the same loopholes would exist.
It would be a contravention of the Act, so it's a practical issue.
It already is a contravention of the Act.
Well, there are improvements to those rules. So right now, third parties cannot use foreign funds, but there's an additional offense for foreign funds making the contribution. So there are improvements on the regime. It is an issue of practice. Now, I understand your concern, and when I made my recommendation, which I continue to favor, I'm cognizant of the fact that this is not a fully closed regime, that there are opportunities. And the reason for that is that I'm mindful of the need for a balance.
And I understand your position, and I respect your position on that, but I'm just trying to get my head around exactly what this regime looks like, because when I asked the question to the officials, I was told that there was no transparency gap, that all contributions would be treated as contributions of individual Canadians, and that third parties that are subject to the exception would have to report those contributions in the same way as all other third-party entities.
That is correct. If it is a contribution, if a contribution was made, then it has to be treated as such and subject to the contribution rules.
But my question goes back to monies that are donated to a third party in years prior to the previous year. Are they captured as contributions?
They are. However, in practice, at that point in time, before the election, there is no mechanism to ensure that it is set aside separately and tracked separately. But it is captured by the law as a contribution.
So in short, there remain loopholes that allow for the possibility of foreign monies to be commingled and used for regulated activities by these third parties that are subject to the exception.
The opportunity for funds to flow exists, and they exist for a reason, which I think is
They exist right now.
they exist right now.
And-
But
and- and they
in the
will continue-
proposed regime,
and they will continue to exist if this bill is adopted in its present form, unamended.
to a much lesser extent, to a much lesser extent. And so to me, it's a significant improvement, but it is a regime that keeps in mind the importance of balancing the rights and the freedoms.
I fully agree that it's an improvement, but my ultimate position is that elections should be decided by Canadians free of interference and free of foreign influence. And when there's the possibility of funds being mingled and directed to third parties, I think that's a problem or an issue that needs to be carefully explored. Now, I've asked you about contributions, but what about issues around revenue? There is nothing, as I see it in the bill, that prevents the source of funds in a non-contribution revenue context from being free. They could be foreign. Is that right? Those funds
In the same way that
that
ordinary
could be used for regulated activities.
ordinary may have investments abroad through their pension funds, for example. A retired teacher may receive, pension
But
from.
okay. We're over. If we can go now, excuse me. Now go to Ms. Vandenbeld, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here again. I'd like to start my questions with Ms. Simard. We heard in our previous meeting with the officials about the rationale for for administrative monetary penalties. That one of the reasons is that if you have to meet the threshold of a criminal charge, less people will be charged. You need to have that flexibility to be able to do administrative penalties, and then there might actually be more consequences for things that are maybe not as severe. But how do you choose that? How would you look at when you would just issue a letter, when you would do a monetary penalty, and when you would go to a criminal charge? Is there criteria? Is there something that, what would be the factors you would take into account?
Alors, essentiellement, le régime de
So basically, the AMPS regime is a more flexible regime, and we look at the gravity of the offense. It's really on a case-by-case basis.
by the operation. So maybe Mr. Bisson could provide you with additional information, more precise information.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. So we do assess any complaint or referral received from elections, for example, would be assessed for the facts, either the allegations or the facts that are provided, and we would assess those against a set of criteria to both prioritize our investigative resources as well as to determine what the desired outcome is, whereas in the administrative monetary penalty regime, the desire is to bring back compliance if it's not, or to enforce and encourage compliance, whereas there's a punitive element to a penal regime. And as you note, there is an element of legal thresholds at play as well that is considered.
And I note that expanding the number of actors that can be affected by this, our campaigns are full of volunteers, many of whom are not necessarily versed in every part of the Elections Act, make honest mistakes. Is this something you would factor in when looking at administrative penalties, or would you look at what their role is in the campaign? Is that part of your criteria?
Je vous dirais que de façon générale,
I would say that generally speaking, this is not part of the factors, neither in the Act nor in our policies. I would say, once again, it really is about an assessment of the facts of each file. Of course, there is an awareness-raising component, so warning letters, for example, and this is what we also do. I would say that the AMPS regime is now under review, and with the potential addition of in C25, we'll continue the review, and our intention is to continue to consult, and it will be an opportunity to take a closer look to how we can best serve the system as well as volunteers.
All of us would be concerned when you have, an 18-year-old student coming to our campaign that they, that be taken into consideration. And the other thing I'm wondering is the expansion of the administrative monetary penalties. That now would allow for a quicker response, because I know I've seen in cases where, going through the criminal justice system can take more than one election. And so the consequences, by the time they come, the member may not even be a member, or the candidate may be, long moved on. Is it quicker to be able to do it through administrative monetary penalties?
La short answer, yes,
Yeah.
and I can explain why. With additional powers like compel, like le pouvoir de contraindre des
The
témoins.
power to bring in witnesses, that does enable us to act more quickly. There are other powers as well. We can act more quickly. We can go further in our investigation.
Aussi, en fait, peut-être pour compléter sur la question des bénévoles.
And perhaps to come back to the question of volunteers, it's important to recall that each complaint has to be taken seriously. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Balance. Thank you.
Thank you. And my next question is for Mr. Perreault. I note that in 2019, 2022, and I remember being on this committee in 2015, where some of these things were already brought up. So I can imagine, my question to you is about the urgency. I can imagine that although every time there's an election, there are issues that you want to put forward, getting these ones done is very important and very urgent.
It is. I think this is an important piece of legislation, and it needs to be examined carefully by this committee in the House and the Senate, of course. But these are changes that are important, and I'm happy to see them being introduced.
And you said in your opening remarks that disinformation is the biggest threat to our democracy. And of course, this bill does have new measures in terms of, spreading false information, things that are known to be false that are intended to undermine the election and its results. But there has been concern, even at the committee expressed about that. Can you tell us why that particular measure is important, not just for the electoral processes, but for our democracy itself?
Very quick answer.
Well, as I said in my remark, I think the measure needs to go larger. I think interfering with the vote is something, there are mechanisms in the Act right now. I think what really is missing, and it has to be a narrow provision with a high bar, but if someone is deliberately spreading falsehood to undermine trust in the results of an election or trust in the election itself, that there needs to be a mechanism in the Act to address this. And that's something that I think can be added to this bill.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, Madame Normandin. Thank you, Mr. Perreault and Madame Simard, for being here. It's always wonderful to have you here. We always learn so much. I have some questions about the idea of potential candidates that was added when it comes to interference and bribery. I'd like to ask you if something has perhaps been forgotten in the definition of regulated financing activities. When I look at the definition, it mentions where a financial gain can be made a party, a registered association, a nomination candidate, a leadership candidate, and a registered party. Should we have added potential candidate? Because this is a place where money can be accumulated by a potential candidate, and a potential candidate cannot accumulate money from regulated activities. It's a very kind of detailed question. Yes, sir. I'd like to know where in the bill we're talking about. Are we talking about regulated fundraising activities? In the bill, it's actually what exists already. There are opinions to change the bill in the bill, but the definition of regulated activities does not cover the idea of potential candidates around, for example, whereas foreign intervention, foreign interference, and bribery does cover it. Is there something that needs to be covered to dot our I's here? I would say there's relatively little fundraising activity that's done upstream by potential candidates, and I think this is a specific choice to lessen the regulatory burden for such entities. But I'm open to covering that as well, all the more because the Act already reduces the regulatory burden on this score. Thank you. So in the same way, in the recommendations that you've made, could you please explain your recommendation number 8 that would add that the candidates, the nomination candidate or leadership candidate's financial agent to in Section 502, could you perhaps explain your recommendation number 8? Just to be consistent, for this type of offense, it covers the not just the candidate, but also the financial agent. And for nomination and leadership candidates, the same coverage is not provided. And maybe it was just omitted earlier. And just to be consistent, it should be included with the addition of an offense for accepting a bribery that would be explained to everyone. This would potentially be covered without adding your recommendation. It would be an illegal act for whoever. Yes, it is covered by bribery. I'd now like to hear you talk a bit. I raised it at the last the last PROC committee meeting, the possibility to withdraw one's name from the electors list if you're a victim of intimate partner violence. And I know this took place in Alberta a little while ago, but in general, is it easy to withdraw one's name from the list of electors? And are such requests made? And is it a mechanism that's known by victims, and could that be improved? I think it's an imperfect system now. It's not. This wasn't my recommendation, but this was a recommendation made in Bill C-65 that someone could be on the electoral registry without their names appearing on the electoral list. It would be on the electoral registry, but would not be on the list provided to candidates. This was in Bill C-65, and it's not here. Right now, anyone can withdraw their name from the electoral registry for whatever the reason. So at the polling station or wherever, but the list will be on the final list, even if they withdraw subsequently. An elector can go to the returning officer and make such a request. Once their address is proved, the address of the returning officer is put on the list rather than the address of the requesting person, and their names will not be on the electoral list except for that returning officer's address. There is a mechanism, but it's not as comprehensive as the one provided for in Bill C-65, and that's why I made the recommendation. And so the idea is to review what was done in C-65 and include it here. Yes. So very quickly on the question of the five-day notice period for regulated financial activities, with the idea is to withdraw the 5-day notice period. Would you say in general that the information that was in the 5-day notice was similar to what we used to get in the final report? Were there many disparities in the people's names, the amount gathered, or were things similar? I don't have any knowledge that there were any such disparities. I could look into it and come back to you on this, but I can't answer the question right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will, I understand Mr. Cooper and Mr. Jackson will be splitting their time. They have 5 minutes, but I will leave that to you both to handle.
Okay. Mr. Perreault, you answered to my last question that where third parties are subject to the exception and they can use their own funds from their non-contribution revenue, there's nothing in the bill that prevents the source of those funds from being foreign. So what is to stop foreign actors from exploiting this exception by directing money to third parties disguised as the purchase of goods or services, funds that would be treated as non-contribution revenue and therefore could be spent by third parties as part of their own funds for regulated activities to influence our elections?
I would answer 2 aspects. One is that this would be an offense under the Act. Of course, it needs to be caught and prosecuted, but it is illegal under the Act. And
It
secondly,
already is illegal.
pardon me?
It already is illegal.
It is illegal. And removing the...
But just because it's illegal doesn't mean that it hasn't been happening.
well,
So,
that's-
so to say that it's illegal, fair, but it doesn't change anything. Your second point
is
so the
that-
first point I don't think addresses the question.
in order to close the regime, you would also have to remove the ability of individuals from using their own funds, because individuals could receive illegally, and as in your scenario, but revenues that they would describe.
There's that exception, but I'm asking you about this specific exception.
If there's a hole here and there's a hole there, there's no usefulness in
We'll
closing
deal with
one.
one hole at a time. So just answer my question.
Well, I'm not here to argue with anyone on this committee about this point. This is an issue. There is always ways for monies to flow around. There are ways to make this regime tighter, but there are consequences to that.
So what would, if on that point, if we were to look at this to say, let's make it tighter, what would you recommend?
First of all, I would not recommend it to make it tighter.
Okay,
but if
thank
the committee wanted to make
I'll
it tighter,
turn it over to Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much time do I have left?
2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank
was
you.
excellent
Mr.
splitting.
Perot, nice to see you again. The last time we were here, I think we were discussing about the security of ballot boxes, and the bill talks about, making sure that there's no disinformation, misinformation, and Canadians having faith in that system. So we were talking specifically about special ballot boxes and the security protocols around those. I asked you that if they ever leave returning offices, to which Ms. Duquette, who was with you, replied no, and then you stated that's unless they are national ballots. Then they need to be shipped to headquarters ahead of day 0, was your quote. What is a national ballot?
is a ballot cast by an elector outside of his riding. Somebody is working for a short period, or a student is traveling or studying, or someone is traveling outside of their riding. They can cast a ballot, and they can apply for what we call a national ballot outside of their electoral district.
Sure.
This is
Okay.
provided for.
Thank you very much for that. I just wanted a little clarity on that. I'm also curious about advanced polling boxes. Can you just walk me through, once advanced polling locations close, what the security protocols are around those ballot boxes until they're opened and counted at the end of Election Day?
So there are, and I could share with the committee more written elements about that, but deputy returning officers have the obligation to safeguard the ballot boxes that they take out of the polling place after polling day. Returning officers in urban settings may request those ballot boxes to be brought back to the returning office where they are secured, typically within a locked room within the locked office, or within a locked cabinet within the locked office. But in many rural and remote areas, that is, of course, not possible. In that case, the deputy returning officer has the obligation to safeguard the box. The box is sealed. The seals are signed by the poll worker and by the witnesses at the count.
Boxes go home to a private residence.
Home where they must be safeguarded at all times until they are returned with the seals. And there are a number of administrative safeguards, such as the number of ballots is identified, the sequence number of ballots used at that poll is identified. So there are tracking mechanisms to make sure that this is the right ballot with the right ballot box with the right ballots in them, and that it has not been opened.
Thank you.
That's okay, Chair.
I cut you
I
off with 3 seconds to go, but yes. We'll now go to Mr. Genereux for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the witnesses for joining us here today. I want to begin my questions with you, Madame Simard. We've seen recently an issue in Alberta that I would love to get your comments on. Can you confirm that you're able to start an investigation on your own initiative, and that a complaint doesn't have to meet certain minimal threshold in order to trigger an investigation, like I believe it did in Alberta?
Alors, pour répondre précisément à la question,
To
d'abord,
respond specifically to the question, let me just say that in relation to Alberta, I can only use public information. For the specific response, According to the Elections Act, I can launch an investigation on my own initiative, and in such a case, hypothetically, if this case were to occur federally, that such opportunity, such a possibility does indeed exist.
What about the, I guess, can you talk to us about the penalties provided under the CEA for misuse of the list of electors and what those would be?
Alors, encore une fois, de façon hypothétique,
So once again, hypothetically, if this were to happen under federal jurisdiction, there is an offense, Section 111F, and the penalties are $10,000, a $10,000 fine. This is a penal, so this is a fine, and there's also 1 year of imprisonment.
Right, and that's similar to the testimony we heard earlier this week. I also want to understand that if your investigation reveals a contravention of the CEA, you have a range of tools that are available to you at your discretion. Could you help us understand what factors that you consider when determining whether to issue a letter, a notice of violation, or an AMP, or whether to lay a criminal charge?
Alors, je vous dirais que
I would say, basically, when we assess the facts, it's a matter of the gravity of the offense. The thing to keep in mind is that when we're in the administrative regime, there are a series of factors to be considered. There are also internal policy that enables us to more clearly define our discretion and the type of infringement and the gravity of the infringement. All of this is considered, and we have clear guidelines.
Alors, la parole peut-être pour des précisions à
Perhaps
Maître.
I could give the floor to Madame Richard.
The current offense that the Commissioner referred to regarding misuse of a personal information, a list of electors, is only part of the criminal regime. We did recommend in our 2022 report to have this provision included as part of the administrative monetary penalty scheme, but it has not been included as part of Bill C-25. So we have the criminal pathway available to us only in a situation similar to Alberta.
Wonderful. I guess probably my last question. Your recommendations report of 2019 and 2021 general elections included a prohibition on providing false, misleading information in nomination papers, which is contained in Bill C-25. Is it your understanding that this would cover a scenario where someone signs a nomination paper that doesn't have the candidate's name on it?
Je vais demander à Maître Richard de répondre.
Yes, we believe that certainly in some scenarios that the new prohibitions on false and misleading statements in a nomination paper, the new violations rather, could be used in a situation such as that one. I would say that the recommendation was made in relation to other cases we had seen, and not one where there's a blank nomination form with no candidate's name, but we think it could apply in some scenarios.
Yeah, I think I'm ceding time, Mr. Chair, but that's the questions I got.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I ask for unanimous consent at this moment or not?
Well, you can ask for unanimous consent.
I'd like 30 seconds to pose a question to Monsieur Perrault. I think it would be a yes or no. It's, of course, up to my colleagues.
Unanimous consent for Ms. May to ask a question. I see heads nodding. Please, I see no objection. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and merci à tous mes collègues. Very briefly, Mr. Perrault, I think I've understood your testimony to be that you stand by the recommendations of the 2022 report from your office, that many of which were included in Bill C-65 that we know died on the order paper. My question is this: do you think Bill C-25 would be stronger if it still included the sections that have been dropped from Bill C-65?
So there are other elements from C-65 that do not relate to the security of the electoral process, and I won't speak to that. There is one element on related to privacy that I have included in my suggested changes, and that relates to the ability to opt out of the lists for concerns of security. So there are elements there that could be brought back. But for the most part, this bill is really reflecting my recommendations of my 2024 report in the context of foreign interference.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, 2 minutes et demi, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes for Madame Normandin. Thank you very much. I'd like to continue along the lines of Mr. Genereux's question on the misuse of confidential information. And we saw what happened, personal information. We saw what happened in Alberta. Is the information provided adequately to candidates when they receive the list, that it is in fact prohibited to share this information? Do they receive this information? Could something be added to the Elections Act so that upstream we discourage candidates, parties, and others with clear information provided in forms? Is there something that's been left out that could perhaps be added to C-25? If I may, let me answer this question. We provide guidelines to members, to candidates, and to political parties. They are not mandatory. There are guidelines that there are certain numbers of commitments that volunteers have to sign to be involved in campaign. These are all guidelines. Some of this could be made mandatory. The bill extends the rules on the question of protecting personal information. It extends it to candidates when they work for the party. It's not exactly clear if it's only in that capacity. It's a matter of limited. It's limited to when candidates work on behalf of the party and not on their own behalf. So perhaps that could be strengthened. That language could be clearer. And similarly, increasingly, parties use computer systems to do door-to-door. We're not just talking about paper lists. There's always a danger of cyber attacks. Could something be done about the use of different platforms? Should we have stronger commitments in terms of the cybersecurity of these platforms that are used to avoid them, all sorts of cyber attacks, phishing, and so forth? Thanks for the question. It's very germane to what we're talking about. Parties have to have rules that protect information commensurate with how sensitive this information is. And this can very well include measures around protecting protecting from cyber attacks. And this is important. And as you know, and I full well know that this doesn't only take place on paper. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper, who I believe is splitting his time with Mr. Cram, but again, I will leave it to the two of you.
To Ms. Simard or Ms. Richard, and just to follow up on the response with respect to the new offense of filing a nomination paper with false or misleading information. I want clarity as to whether the provision as drafted would capture a situation such as the one in which there was some evidence that the longest ballot committee engaged in, whereby they went around or were alleged to have gone around and had multiple blank nomination forms, had electors sign those forms, and then after the fact filled in a candidate's name. Would that be captured by this?
I would note that I believe the Chief Electoral Officer has the ability to add additional pieces into the nomination form itself. For example, indicating that it's a contravention to sign more than one nomination paper, and it could be we could through the OGI process as well provide guidance in terms of that being considered to be false and misleading, so that we would be able to use those new contraventions, which are violations, and tackle that type of scenario. Of course, there may be facts that still get around it, but that's the idea, that we would be able to use those.
Mr. Perot, would you Care to
Yes,
weigh in?
it is my intention to revisit the nomination paper to look at the different ways in which we could instill the greatest possible clarity in that regard, and that would support the work of the commissioner.
One way to simply address it is to add an amendment that would expressly make it an offense to induce electors to sign multiple blank nomination forms, in addition to making it an offense to submit a nomination paper with false and misleading information.
Correct. So there is a provision in the bill that deals with counseling people to commit various offenses, including signing multiple nomination papers. Now, that would not capture the signing a blank nomination paper. That is not expressly addressed in the bill, so it could be specifically mentioned.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Perot, my question will be directed towards you. So, as you are aware, this committee studied in depth some of the disruptive behaviors of the longest ballot committee, and we provided a report with recommendations to the House not too long ago. One of the recommendations was to update the nomination papers to explicitly state that electors are not allowed to sign more than one paper. And when we had the minister here earlier this week, I pointed out that particular recommendation was not included in the bill, and he said that was because you already had the power to do that. And so I will ask you what I asked the minister on Tuesday. Is that something that you are planning to act on outside of the bill?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, that was easy. Mr. Chair, how am I doing for time?
You have a minute 15.
Okay, so Mr. Pro, you mentioned the issue of deep fakes in your opening statement, and it occurred to me that if we were having this conversation even a couple of decades ago, the whole idea of deep fakes would be in the realm of science fiction. But as we know, technology can evolve very quickly, and often laws and regulations fail to keep up. So I'm wondering if you feel that the rules put in place are flexible enough and robust enough that the laws can be enforced even as the technology evolves.
Correct. I do believe that the wording was carefully drafted to provide some flexibility in that regard. Now, I wish I knew the future and could guarantee that it will capture all the mischief that the future will bring to us, but I do believe it was well drafted with that in mind.
And you also mentioned in your opening statement about the idea of standardized labeling mechanisms for AI-generated content. Can you briefly elaborate on how that would work?
Briefly, please.
So that's something that could be done more broadly. The Committee on Heritage recently recommended that it be done across all communications. Of course, in the context of the Elections Act, my recommendations would be made specific to electoral communications, and we would have to define in the Act what is captured by electoral communications. Right now, certainly the Act captures advertising, but it should be much larger than advertising. It certainly should be communications in the electoral context made by all regulated political entities, including third parties, at a minimum. It could be made broader, but the point is that electors should be aware when they see whether it's when they see an ad or hear an audio recording, that if it has been modified using AI, that they be on the alert.
Thank you so much. We'll now go to Madame Brière. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for all of you being with us this morning. You talked about the new financing rules to strengthen transparency, to avoid that funds from anonymous and foreign sources or obscure sources are injected into our democratic system. What would the danger be if we remove the possibility of third-party actors from funding? It's a question of rights and freedoms. Canadians, whether as individuals or groups, don't necessarily plan to get involved in an election that is not necessarily on a fixed date. and they might decide to participate. If we were to put in place a system which only enabled the use of regulated funding, it would mean that they have to upstream have a kind of fundraising branch in the event that they decide to get involved in elections. So in terms of rights and freedoms, do we want all individuals and groups to be in this kind of constant fundraising mode with the... So I understand the concerns that were raised by Mr. Cooper, for example, but I think we have to be careful here before going further in this direction. And indeed, do you think that in the provisions of C-25 we go far enough? I'd like to be able to guarantee it, but I can't. I've made my recommendations, and I think we'll have to see if this should be enhanced. This is the nature of the legislative process. We go through experiences and we strengthen accordingly. I think this does significantly strengthen the overall regime compared to what exists now. Basically, this means that entities, what in English are called fundraising entities, could not have would no longer be able to use third-party foreign funds. Your recommendation was based on a lived experience here in Canada, or did you also look to things happening outside Canada? Did you observe practices that might concern us here? In 2015, since 2015 in Canada, we've heard concerns expressed about groups and their sources of funding, and also, of course, in the United States. I'm not saying it was that this funding was bad faith or ill-intentioned, but there have been growing concerns about foreign sources of funding. And now when you look at what's happening now, I think we can say that it has become urgent to tackle these questions. So this leads to my second question. In the media today or yesterday, Stephanie Gramond tells us that Russia is injecting $3 to $4 billion every year, and we see that this has worked, that they're kind of spreading their tentacles and information everywhere. And whereas we spent about $30 million to counter this type of interference, and AI, of course, makes things much easier for these actors. Bots can create this false and misleading information. Do you think we're on the right track here with Bill C-25 to counter these efforts? Answer, I think this is one brick in a bigger building that we have to build. There's a question of raising citizens' awareness. People should learn from school age that should they be better shielded, better prepared against this type of interference. It's a huge problem, it's a complex problem, and it will require a lot more than what's in C-25. Very quickly, do I have time? So protections are provided for against illegal influencing over voters' choices, and the bill allows for not only when the writ is dropped, but at all times. Yes, this is a recommendation that I made. The provision that was passed in 2019 is just limited to the writ period. And what we've observed is that these interference activities don't take place only during the writ period. So this is an important change that needs to be made. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our witnesses. Before we suspend for a couple minutes, I'm just hoping to present the budget that was circulated to committee members. Is there any opposition to the budget? Seeing none, it is carried. We will suspend for a few minutes. introduce our second panel. As individuals, Charles Burton, who's Senior Fellow at Synopsis, Andrea Lawler, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, McMaster University by video conference. And I'm sorry that this troubles me every single time, Professor Turnbull, but Laurie Turnbull, Professor, Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. Even though I said it that way, I still do hold on to the fact that St. Catharines says it right. It is Dalhousie. But anyway, on that note, we'll turn, Mr. Burton understands, having spent some time in St. Catharines. We'll turn to you, Mr. Burton. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service has characterized foreign interference by China as the greatest strategic threat to Canada because of its pervasive, persistent, and sophisticated state-sponsored threat activity targeting Canadian democratic institutions. That's a quote. The CSIS 2025 public report that was tabled in Parliament on May the 1st continues to identify China as the most active and sophisticated source of foreign interference and espionage in Canada. Bill C-25 responds to the specific evidence of Chinese influence and interference in Canadian federal elections centered on intelligence assessments from CSIS, reviews by the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, and Commissioner Ogg's public inquiry into foreign interference in federal electoral processes and democratic institutions. The urgent necessity for legislation to address the current Chinese regime's challenges to the integrity of our democratic process is underscored by two escalating threats. One, under-party General Secretary Xi Jinping.
Just to stop you there for a second. Just, I know it's challenging with the mics. Just be careful when you're flipping pages, not to hit the mics. Thank you so much.
I did that last time I was here. I'm sorry. I'm a slow learner. Number one, under-party General Secretary Xi Jinping, the Chinese regime has vastly expanded the resources of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department's foreign operations. Working alongside the Ministry of State Security, this apparatus actively employs covert, coercive, and corrupt means to undermine Canadian democratic institutions in the favor of a hostile autocratic regime. Number two, rapid advances in artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology are acting as force multipliers for China's subversive machinations in Canada. This bill is about countering bribery, intimidation, misleading publications, unauthorized computer use, and social media posting of deep fakes originating inside and outside Canada. Looking at the specific language, we have, for example, the proposed amendment to the Elections Act, Section 282.4, in the bill, Clause 8, General Elections, and it says, foreign entities / powers cannot unduly influence electors by knowingly incurring expenses to promote / oppose candidates, potential candidates, parties, or leaders. Then we have the proposed amendments to sections 349.95, pre-election period, and 358, election period, which in the bill are clauses 19 and 23. A third party shall use only contributions from Canadian individuals to pay for regulated expenses, and shall use as regulated expenses only property and services that are contributions from Canadian individuals. Well, all of this is high-flown language, but the practical question remains. Once Bill C-25 becomes Canadian law, will it empower CSIS and the RCMP to successfully investigate and prosecute the strongly alleged illicit campaign financing and covert interference by Chinese diplomats in their and their proxies in ridings such as Vancouver East, Stevenson, Richmond East, and Don Valley North. Or the CSIS report from December 20th, 2021, cited by David Johnston in his independent special rapporteur on foreign interference activity that says, and I quote, sympathetic donors were encouraged to provide campaign contributions to candidates favored by China, donations for which they received a tax credit from the federal government. Then the recipient political campaigns, quietly and illegally, returned part of the contribution, which was the difference between the original donation and the government's refund, back to the donors. To date, none of the individuals, a large number of individuals implicated in these very serious allegations, have faced consequences. None of the Chinese diplomats involved have been declared persona non grata, and non-diplomatic proxies for the Chinese regime have yet to be held accountable in a Canadian court of law. In the absence of a robust foreign influence transparency registry, in these aspects, Bill C-25 risks being more performative than substantive. I wonder if these proposed amendments to the Canada Elections Act can effectively address the credible threat that agents of the People's Republic of China pose to Canada's electoral process. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, I thank the excellent committee interpreters for their work.
Thank you so much. Professor Lawler, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dr. Andrea Lawler. I'm an associate professor in political science and in the Masters of Public Policy Digital Society at McMaster University, though my comments today represent only my own views. My research focuses on third-party finance, elections administration, and public trust in political institutions. I thank the committee for the invitation to speak on Bill C-25, and I speak largely in support in the direction of the bill, but also point to some limitations that, if addressed, can greatly enhance public confidence in Canada's elections infrastructure. The Act contains many updates to the Canadian political finance regime, consistent with the recommendations made by Elections Canada following the Foreign Interference Commission that better protect the electoral ecosystem against threats of domestic and foreign interference. On third parties, I acknowledge the addition of the own funds provision that permits third parties to use their own money in regulated expenses so long as it does not exceed 10% of the group's annual revenues. Restricting the acceptance of prepaid cards or cryptocurrency is also a positive change, though I would highlight that this does not close off the possibility of foreign funds entirely. The increase to investigative and disclosure powers of the Commissioner of Canada Elections and their ability to greater levy administrative monetary penalties will give electoral administrators the ability to address contraventions to the Act with greater efficacy. I would equally encourage the legislature to ensure that increases to these penalties continue to reflect the economic environment, as it is always a risk that underpowered amps may be seen by malevolent actors as the cost of doing business. I would point to the enhancements to Part 17.1 of the Act that bring nomination and leadership contestants into the Act on prohibition against false or misleading information. Changes that address deep fakes and AI-generated images move in the right direction, though I would caution that there are more ways for AI to be leveraged by bad actors to disrupt Canadian elections that the Act currently contemplates. Perhaps of greater importance, however, are the amendments made to the Act around personal information data handling. I support changes that require parties to create security safeguards where there is a real risk of significant harm to an individual involved in a data breach, though significant harm excludes many violations to privacy that could still suppress democratic participation. Yet I would argue that even under this new legislation, too little is being required of political parties when it comes to protecting voter information. As this committee well knows, political parties are private organizations, though the recipients of considerable public monies, and yet they do not fall under PIPEDA. At present, data-driven campaign practices, such as micro-targeting, precision ads, and voter relationship management platforms, have virtually no oversight, no mechanisms for disposal of data, right of access, ability to obtain corrections, or for citizens to withdraw their consent to the use of their data. While the Act does require parties to disclose data breaches and imposes some technical safeguards, these remain limited. Most concerning is that the new provisions around data safeguards are reliant on parties passing their own internal policies that contain these measures rather than statutory requirement. When we consider the vast volume and variety of data that parties collect on Canadians beyond standard demographic factors, which may include religion, number, and age of children, as well as personal economic data, it is not difficult to see the potential for exposure. Indeed, the recent data breach in Alberta, where personal information of millions of Albertans was made available in an online searchable database, highlights that internal party mechanisms may not be sufficient to protect voter data and give the public little recourse. The legislation can proactively address this by standardizing breach notification practices, creating strong prohibitions around the sale, transfer, disclosure, and use of personal information, and strong penalties where those laws are contravened. Finally, I would emphasize a concern around oversight and enforceability. Canada's Privacy Commissioner has been given no new powers to work alongside Elections Canada or the Commissioner, missing an opportunity to leverage the body that has expertise in privacy auditing and enforcement. Other jurisdictions, such as the EU, the UK, and New Zealand, have strong privacy protection laws, including GDPR and ICO guidance. Quebec and British Columbia have been leaders in protecting citizens from parties' non-commercial uses of personal data, but Canadians are looking to the federal government to provide leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will, excuse me, start with the Conservatives. Mr. Cooper. Oh, sorry. You must think I'm bullying you with the Dalhousie jokes and then excluding you. Dr. Turnbull, 5 minutes, please. My apologies.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the committee for inviting me to be part of the conversation. I think that the measures included in Bill C-25 are very important to the health of democracy in Canada, and I welcome the chance to talk about this in more detail. I need to start with a disclaimer. As you know, several of the measures contained in Bill C-25 have connections to the report of the Public Inquiry into Foreign Interference. It was my pleasure to serve as one of the 4 members of the Research Council that worked with Justice Hogue throughout the course of the Commission and in the creation of the final report. So while I could not be more excited, more proud about my connection to that exercise, I want to stress that I'm here today as an individual. Nothing that I say should be interpreted as reflective of how Madame Hogue feels about anything or anybody else that worked with the committee either, or with the Commission, sorry. So, the scope of Bill C-25 is wide-ranging and contains measures aimed at dealing with foreign interference, ballot manipulation, disinformation, the misuse of personal data, and other things. But I'm sure we'll get to all of that, so I'm going to limit my opening comments to one particular thing that I wanted to raise about the bill. It would extend the reach of the law, and therefore Elections Canada, farther into the span of activities that are usually run by political parties, specifically nomination and leadership contests. So, for example, the bill would extend the prohibition on the use of broadcasting stations outside of Canada to influence voters to nomination and leadership contests and contestants. Would extend the ban on the use of foreign funds, services, and property for promoting advertising to leadership and nomination contests and contestants, and would amend the definition of partisan activity in Section 349 to include leadership contests. I think this is really important. I think this is an important part of the bill because it recognizes that those nomination and leadership contests are not solely the purview of political parties, but they are really important parts of our election process. And without those measures, the only way that Elections Canada actually provides any oversight into the leadership and nomination contests is largely through watching the money, whether it's through contributions and spending, well, both, and also with candidate registration in the nomination process. So once the party confirms who the candidate is, they tell Elections Canada, so the name's on the ballot, obviously. But I think because of the emergent challenges we have, there's a need to think about going a step further. And I think the bill does that, at least in some initial in an initial way. I think we all know nomination and leadership contests have become the subject of some media attention in recent years, often because there's a concern that they are a vulnerable part of the election system and they could be even a target for different types of interference, including foreign interference. in an editorial by the Globe and Mail in November of 2025, referred to these exercises as a massive weak spot in Canadian democracy because they are almost totally unregulated. Parties tend to resist the infiltration of Elections Canada officials into their nomination and leadership contests, arguing that they are private clubs that run their own affairs. I actually think there's a lot of value to political parties being able to run themselves according to their own values. I think it means that Canadians have real choice between parties. I think it's important to do that. But I also think that there's an increasingly complex gray area where what is a private club is also a custodian of public office, which is what makes it so compelling to so many people. And so I think we do need to think about different ways where that space can be regulated appropriately. So I welcome the fact that the bill takes a step in that direction, and just wanted to flag that before we get into all the details of the bill. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we will turn to Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Burton. The PRC, for all intents and purposes, has its largest diplomatic footprint in Canada. It has nearly 3 times as many accredited diplomats in Canada as it does in Australia, despite Australia having much stronger trade ties with Beijing, a comparable population to Canada, and a comparably sized diaspora community. In fact, the PRC has roughly the same number of accredited diplomats in Canada as it does in the United States. So, given that, is it fair to say that the reason Beijing has such an outsized diplomatic presence in Canada because Beijing sees Canada as a soft target for its foreign interference and transnational repression activities?
Yes, I think so. I was quite surprised to find out that in addition to the very large embassy on St. Patrick's Street, the Chinese authorities have other buildings in Ottawa to accommodate their diplomatic cohort, which is, I think, something like 3 or 4 times that of Japan and even more multiplied of what we have for the Indians currently. So assuming that Chinese diplomats work as efficiently as diplomats of other countries, then one cannot but assume that a large number of those people that we have accredited as diplomats in Canada are engaged in activities which are not part of legitimate diplomatic activities. In other words, that we expelled one single Ministry of State Security agent, Zhao Wei, when there was some exposure in the Globe and Mail about his activities to potentially intimidate the family of the conservative foreign policy critic Michael Chong. But I think there are a lot more of them. So the question really is, and I don't really understand it, is why do we have so many more Chinese diplomats accredited to Canada than we have Canadian diplomats accredited to China? How did this situation arise? And seeing as it's within the rights of a country to agree or not agree to a diplomat based on what their function is supposed to be. The Chinese have attempted to have police stationed in Vancouver, and we refused. Why don't we determine how many diplomats they need and declare the rest of them persona non grata and send them back to Beijing, which would reduce this problem that I've tried to identify, which is we haven't been able to deal with these revelations that have come through the past couple of years in the Hague Commission and the CSIS documents. And similarly, next month is the 2nd anniversary of enacting Bill C-70, the Counter Foreign Interference Act, and I've been watching it pretty closely, and I haven't seen any evidence of any foreign interference being countered whatsoever over the past 2 years. So, I think maybe addressing it at the source, as you suggest, would be a better idea.
Well, and with respect to Beijing's accredited diplomats, it's not just looking at the number and speculating that these diplomats are involved in foreign interference activities and transnational repression. It's well established, isn't it?
Yes, I think we do have evidence that this is going on because of the activities that the leaked CSIS assessments that subsequently have been affirmed to be genuine have been warning the government about. And so, there's no question that Chinese diplomats are very active in activities which are not consistent with normal diplomatic function.
That Madam Justice Hogue concluded that the PRC's Toronto consulate interfered in the 2019 Don Valley North Liberal nomination to support Han Dong, who became the Liberal candidate and then a Liberal MP. Beijing's Vancouver consulate had its footprints all over interference activities in the 2021 election in the Lower Mainland to defeat Conservative candidates, including targeting then MP Kenny Chiu with a mass disinformation campaign, and Joe Tay, the Conservative candidate in Don Valley North in the 2025 election, had a bounty placed on him by Beijing, and there is credible evidence that Beijing's Toronto consulate was involved in intimidation and voter suppression tactics in Don Valley North. In the face of these egregious and blatant attacks on our sovereignty and our democratic processes, the Liberal government has done absolutely nothing to deal with the Toronto consulate or the Vancouver consulate, have they?
No, and I think that, I think what we're looking at here is a very large Chinese Communist Party operation, whether it's the United Front Work Department or otherwise. I mean, if you look at the rank of the Chinese Consul General in Vancouver, this person is a much higher rank in the communist regime than one would expect for someone who is a Consul General in a single North American city, suggesting that their responsibilities far exceed their diplomatic function.
And not a single diplomat has been expelled for these interference activities. You cited Zhao Wei, but outside of Zhao Wei, not a single diplomat expelled, correct?
Yes, and I'm discouraged, and I did make a recommendation to the OG Commission that we look into that. So far, it hasn't been acted on.
A single accredited diplomat summoned. The ambassador has not been summoned in respect of these specific activities related to interference in our elections.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, that was a very quick answer. Thank you so much. We will now go to Mr. Genroux for 6 minutes, please. Oh, Madame Kayabaga?
Sure.
Madame Kayabaga, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my colleague for allowing me to go first. I just want to welcome all of you back to our committee. I appreciate the time that you take to help us move this really important conversation for Canadians along. Dr. Turnbull, I'll start with you. In the public inquiry into foreign interference in the federal electoral process and democratic institution confirmed that our elections remain secure for the large part. No democracy is immune to growing threats to elections that attempt to undermine confidence and erode trust in our democratic electoral process. And that's why we must continue to ensure that our democracy remains one of the strongest in the world. And that it continues to be protected from ongoing threats whenever they arise. In that vein, I think that we can all agree that it is past time for the recommendation from the public inquiry into foreign interference to be implemented. So my question to you would be, could you comment on the importance of applying election protections for undue foreign influence, offering or accepting a bribe, broadcasting outside of Canada, and misleading publications year-round?
And the importance of this for elections or broadly, like leadership
Broadly.
nomination? Okay.
Actually, both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to start with some of the things you said prior to the question part, because I think that's really important. I think that democracies, Canada and elsewhere, we are facing a very serious array of threats to the health of democracy. And I actually don't think that we can regulate or legislate our way out of all of those things. There's only so much, as much as, of course, we want to make sure that the legislation is an appropriate tool to deal with the problems. We want to make sure we get it right. We don't want to pass legislation and then say, okay, look, there's a whole bunch of gaps that we didn't get to, actually, and we missed the mark. But I think there's only so much with respect to the health of democracy that a piece of legislation can achieve, even if it's done really well. And so health of democracy is going to relate to things like civic literacy, voter engagement, having voter trust in processes, for voters to know that the processes that elect people are secure, they have integrity, there's accountability if things go wrong, there will be some accountability and price to pay if people break the rules. Like, the public really needs to know that. And I think as much as we know we are not the United States, we can see sometimes when they're having real conversations and real disagreements about how they're going to count votes, people not wanting to abide by and not wanting to accept results they don't like. Those sorts of conversations have a big effect on us. So I say all that because I think it's important to note that there are things that we can do to boost the health of the democracy that we are going to rely on no matter how good the legislation is. It's not going to work if people aren't really engaged. In terms of making sure that we say it out loud and we put it in law, there is no, we do not tolerate undue influence from foreign actors. I think it's really important to let voters know that that is wrong. That's not appropriate. That's not something that's part of a healthy democracy. Our decisions as an electorate have to be our own. And we need, there's always going to be foreign actors who want to talk about what they want to see in a Canadian election, and there's a difference between interference and influence. That's why I think we say the undue influence in the law. It's about not spending money on it, not doing this in a way that's clandestine, not doing it in a way that's undermining the legitimacy of the result, as much as people from other countries will absolutely talk about who they think should win the Canadian election. That's okay. We can handle that. That's okay. It's the actual campaigning activity that could happen that we want to get our arms around.
I agree with you. One of the key measures in this bill is also addressing deepfakes, false information. I think this bill is going to go a little farther in addressing when people use false information on candidates and propagate it and provide it to electors in the vein of trying to dissuade or to lead an election to go a certain way. I wonder what your thoughts would be around that prohibition of false information sharing, and where it is shown that the person knew that a statement was false, but they still sort of framed it to be something that a candidate has said, and the measures and what's the threshold, and what your thoughts are around keeping the trust of our electors in our democracy as well as we move towards that step.
Well, I think we're really asking people to be very discerning when it comes to how they allow themselves to be affected by information, to be able to understand the difference between information and disinformation and misinformation. We're asking people to be savvy about that. And so it stands to reason to me, if we're going to do that, then we also have to make sure that we're protecting a space around elections where people can trust that people who are actually contesting the elections are not going to be able to use sources of information or data that allow them to misrepresent things. I think that there needs to, as much as we need to strike a balance between making sure that we're not censoring, but at the same time there are reasons to do it.
What do you think is this threshold to kind of make sure that we're not including personal opinion and what is considered to be parody and just in that, yeah.
Ugh. That's a harder. Yeah, that's hard. I was trying to answer the easy stuff, but yeah, that's really hard because I think in a lot of ways we've had some trouble with this before, right? Previous, I don't remember how many years ago, maybe it was 7 years ago. We tried to do the government tried to do a change to prohibit false information, even if the person didn't know it was false, and so it was overdoing it to the point that it was really difficult to try to justify that because it was too far. But at the same time,
I'll have to cut you off at that point. My apologies. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, l'enfant.
Thank you to all our witnesses. I have questions for everyone, but I'd like to start with you, Mr. Burton. You spoke about the ability for foreign agents to use proxies to fund candidates supported by foreign actors. You talked about how often people would receive money that corresponds to the amount that comes out of their pocket, because some of the amount, of course, is refunded by the public purse. So someone donates $400, gets $300 back as a tax credit. The foreign agent pays that person $100. So logically, are we saying here that the state is actually funding foreign interference with the tax credits?
Well, yes. I mean, that's how this scam worked, and presumably the refunds were made through these police stations, these covert offsite institutions serving the Chinese government's interest. I don't think that the people who received the money back, went to the Chinese embassy and got it from there. So it is indicative of problems in our enforcement of Canadian law, and everybody who was involved in this scheme clearly knew that it was illegal. I mean, there's no ambiguity about it. You were being given an under the table refund for your donation. So, I mean, I'm just beside myself. But the issue for me really is, will it stop? Are we actually going to prevent this behavior from persisting in the next election in certain ridings that the Chinese state has identified as amenable to their subversion? And the question of what are the rewards for this? I think some of it are rewards which the people who are colluding with agents of the Chinese state are receiving back in China. So how do we trace that kind of scheme, which is transnational and covert and corrupt?
Merci beaucoup. Sur la question spécifique des
Thank you.
crédits
On the
d'impôt.
specific question of tax credits, whether one agrees or not with the idea of tax credits when donations are made to political parties, under the current system, the government, when it provides a tax credit to proxies, it's paying from its own funds to fund foreign interference on itself. So whether one agrees with the principle or not, if you remove the tax credit, that could have an impact on foreign interference. I see Madame Turnbull would like to jump in here.
So to the question, to the part that you raised about like what might our opinions be about, like I think it's important for there to be public funding for political parties. I think that I would be in favor of reinstating the per vote subsidy. I was sad to see that go. I think it's important for parties to be able to have some base of funding to be able to compete, keep the lights on, and I think there have been a lot of negative implications, frankly, to the struggle to try to recruit donations. You can donate up to $1,700-ish, but most people don't donate anywhere near that, and you end up having to compete for these tiny organizations, these tiny bits of money. And I think that's a lot of what actually leads to some of the toxic rhetoric that we see in politics a lot of the time, but that's a whole other thing. I think it's completely in the public interest for there to be public funds directed at political parties, 100%. But I completely agree with my colleague. If that money is then being used to turn around to go back to give a tax credit for money that should never have been given in the first place, well then, yes, then it's part of the problem.
Merci. Peut-être, Madame Lawler, sur la...
Madame Lawler, on the matter of data protection, parties often use third parties who provide computer services to manage data for door-to-door canvassing, for example. Do you have any recommendations about how these companies who provide these third-party computer services should guarantee the cybersecurity of data? Do you think we could go further in terms of controlling all of this?
Thank you so much for the question. You are absolutely correct in identifying third-party data brokers as an important source of information for political parties and other organizations, ones that are currently not adequately captured under the legislative framework. These are commercial bodies that are selling or transferring information to and from political parties and are absolutely sites of potential data breaches. Because they sort of operate on the fringes of political parties or sort of in consultation with political parties, but aren't restricted in the same way that political parties are. And it's really up to political parties at this juncture to regulate their own behaviors through their own internal policies. It does represent a site for potential misuse of voter data. And I think that we can see in the Alberta example, there are also other examples across jurisdictions where we have seen violations of people's individual privacy rights because of these breaches that can occur at that juncture, that these bodies are, as commercial bodies, are also playing a really important role in our democratic exercise, but aren't caught by the legislation.
Thank you so much. Mr. Jackson, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Nice to see you both again. Dr. Turnbull, I'm going to direct most of my questions to you. You've testified here at this committee in previous parliaments on this topic, and I've gone back because when the minister and his team were here, I'm trying to get to the bottom of a scenario that, as a new member of parliament, I find a bit odd that it exists, and I would argue that most Canadians probably have no idea that foreign money really ends up in third-party hands that then they can use for elections purposes. I don't know that that's really all that widely understood in the Canadian general public. And so under the provisions of the Act, there's still the 10% loophole that they're arguing is necessary. And you had said, and this is a quote from when you were being asked questions by Mr. Richards, I'd be happy if for political contributions that are kept in a separate bank account, like the bill is advocating those limits applied all the time. I fear that's not going to survive a court challenge. I'm curious if you could just outline your thoughts on that a little bit in more detail.
So I think that was probably in 2018. Yeah, I believe so. And so not knowing exactly what was in my head at the time, but trying to extract what will I say to that now?
Also what the minister and his team said, that this, having third parties be allowed to use zero contributions would not survive a court challenge. And I'm trying to understand why it would be a charter infringement for third parties to not be allowed to use foreign money in Canadian election activities. I just don't understand.
I don't know why it would either, and I wonder if it has to do with what the third party would have to prove, like in terms of if you've got the money that's part of your own funds, it's there for a period of time. Like at a certain point, if this foreign money got into your own funds account, it's there for a while. What if at some point, if there's a 10% threshold, it did get used for something, and that is in the space of regulated activity? Would a third party really be held to account for that after a certain period? Would they be able to be like? Could it be proven that that's exactly what they intended to do? I mean, personally, and now I'm gonna have to go look this up too because I'm not 100% sure why. But I wonder if it has to do with just being able to be fully accountable for that, especially after enough time has gone by. Right.
And so my additional concern then here is that, we were talking about the year prior to a pre-writ period, right, is what they're going to hold accountable the financing from foreign contributions for. But foreign actors are going to read this bill when it becomes law. They're going to understand when Canadians now are in a majority, it's a set election date. I mean, there's obviously some flexibility in that, but they're going to have a general sense of what year the election's going to be in. And so if it's not contributions, but say a foreign actor contracts services with a third party for $1 million in the year prior to the year prior, and then that would be considered revenue rather than a contribution because they've purchased a service, but then that money could still theoretically be used 3 years down the road by the third party to work on campaigning.
As long as it's in that 10%.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. And their revenue has now increased, and so that 10% becomes higher because the revenue of the organization is now higher based on the contracting of those services.
Yes.
So is there a way to deal with that? Because I think that's a backdoor loophole, too, that should be addressed, right? These third parties, the foreign actors are smart. They're going to catch on to this provision very quickly.
Of course. They're smart. This is their business. They want to do this, 100%. This isn't hard. This is not a hard code to crack, obviously. And I mean, the only way I think that you're going to be able to make sure that none of those foreign funds gets into the election orbit at all is to absolutely enforce a separation of accounting where all of that is going into this fund over here, and is not allowed to cross-pollinate with any money that can legitimately used for regulated expenses. Now, groups are going to be affected differently by this, obviously, right? For a lot of groups that act as third parties in elections, they have whole other lives with whole other services they provide. They might have entirely legitimate reasons why they would be receiving funds from outside Canada to do whatever their operations are, whatever. Whereas there's some third parties that probably have no interaction at all in their operations with a foreign entity, so they would get no foreign money for legitimate reasons. And so putting the onus on the third parties to say you have to keep your money separate and this is important enough, like, it's a loophole, 100%.
Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay, Chair.
We'll now go to Mr. Genroux for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I was going to start my questions with Ms. Lawler, but might just follow up on some of that, only because some of it pertained to the first hour of questioning that my colleague from across the aisle had indicated. It's my understanding that the charter argument referenced by the minister and then the chief electoral officer in response to a question in the first hour today relates to the freedom of speech. The argument is that it is important that the door be kept open by 10% to enable third parties to use their own funds when they're generally generated from Canadian sources, for example, things like membership dues. Hoping that maybe Ms. Turnbull, you can speak to some of that.
Thank you. And okay, that part makes sense to me, and I get the freedom of expression argument, but it strikes me that you could still have that in place and still ask for a separate kind of organization of funds. If you wanted to take out that, like, if you wanted to make sure that none of that 10% the own funds is also including money that came from a foreign entity, we could ask for a separation out of those funds to make sure they don't make it in the 10%. I'm fine with the 10%. I don't think that's a problem, and I think that the freedom of expression argument holds fine. I think if we want to make sure that none of the foreign funds is used for that, we have to ask for a separating out of those funds altogether.
Yeah, well, appreciate that. I think just wanted to throw that in context in terms of the conversation we're just having. But Ms. Lawler, I do want to get to you, particularly when it comes to your dissertation titled "Administering Electoral Democracy: The Administrative Constitutionalism of Canadian Federal Election Law." You indicate your support for the Commissioner of Canada Elections being able to enter into information sharing agreements as proposed by Bill C-25, hoping that you can expand on some of your testimony to this committee and why that's an important measure.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I do agree with the changes that have been made to the Act that empower the Commissioner of Canada Elections to a greater degree, both in terms of the investigative powers that they'll now possess, as well as the powers to transfer information in reciprocal relationships with other governments or other actors. This is part of, I believe, the recommendations that come out of the Commission on Foreign Interference that suggests that the Commissioner should have greater latitude in order to do the work that is traditionally done by the Office of the Commissioner. Often in the past, as I believe the Commissioner indicated this morning, there's been a certain amount of discretion that has been exercised by that office so that while people are being caught by the Act, the appropriate mechanism for dealing with a contravention is set up to address the type of contravention and also the nature of the actor. For example, there's a past instance wherein a number of university students ran afoul of the Act, likely in ways that they did not understand. And in that case is a large administrative monetary penalty the right move? No, we wouldn't want to suppress the activity of university students who are becoming acclimatized to the political ecosystem. And in that sense, it is important that the Commissioner has that sort of discretion to issue smaller orders or letters or other approaches to dealing with contraventions. What C-25 does contemplate is the fact that the Commissioner is a very powerful actor, or has the potential to be an even more powerful actor in making sure that the information that is circulating in the background with respect to potential data breaches, to potential misuse of funds, undue foreign influence, undue influence even in the domestic context, that the Commissioner can be more proactive in addressing these types of potential infractions or contraventions of the Act.
Great, that you covered my second question. So I'll skip down. Hoping that you, in some of your testimony, you talked about why you agree with the provisions in Bill C-25 that extend to the existing prohibition of third parties from using foreign funds for partisan activities related to elections and nomination contests to include leadership contests. I'm hoping you can elaborate on some of your comments there.
Generally speaking, I believe that the laws that exist around third-party finance regulation have been quite strong in Canada. There's always room for improvement. I think C-25 gestures in this direction, particularly with the own funds provision. I am pleased to see that the Act is bringing in nomination contests and leadership contests to a greater degree on a number of dimensions in terms of protecting both the activities of the parties themselves, but also Canadians who make up these parties. I do think that one of the advantages of the own funds provision, as you asked Dr. Turnbull, is the fact that it does make some space for third parties to continue to engage in political expression as contemplated by Section 2B and as the Supreme Court of Canada has mentioned in much of its jurisprudence around third parties, from Figueroa to Harper to Working Families. We see evidence that the third-party regime continues to promote that egalitarian approach to third-party finance while still providing opportunities for organizations.
I'm going to have to cut it off there. I do apologize. You'll have other opportunities. We will turn to Madame Normandin, 2 minutes et demi, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Mr. Burton, I'd like to hear you following Madame Turnbull's remarks about the idea of reinstating per vote subsidy with perhaps ceilings and getting rid of tax credits without necessarily taking a position on the philosophical side of things. Could that have a positive impact on foreign interference, for example, if we at least gave further thought to these matters?
I think, that similar to what Ms. Briere was saying, that the Chinese and the Russians have enormous resources that they're dedicating to this kind of work. I mean, the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party is a couple of times the entire Chinese Foreign Ministry. So they're dedicating a terrific amount of effort to this. So I feel that they will always find some way to do an end run around us or find some kind of loophole that will allow them to exert influence where they feel it should be exerted. So, certainly this particular scheme about getting lots and lots of people to donate and then get the refund is one, but other methods of funding also can arise. I just think that they will do more and more. And as I said in my opening statement, they are expanding their resources to their Canadian operations significantly, and AI and other computer enhanced methods allow them to do it much better. And this includes the problem of disinformation, a very serious problem of disinformation, particularly within the community that get their information in the Chinese language.
Très rapidement, Madame Turnbull, vous avez parlé de l'idée de réglementer.
Madame Turnbull, you talked about better regulating nomination races other than just through monetary punishments. What would your other recommendations be?
Okay. Well, I think it's important, for example, to take some of the pieces around undue influence by foreign entities, things like that, and apply it specifically to leadership and nomination contests. We know what happens. We know that foreign actors see these contests as part of the electoral process and also a space that might be easier to penetrate than elections at the ballot box where people are showing up and casting their ballots in person. Like we don't really hear, that those are the issues. Are in a ballot box intimidation in Canada? That's not what we hear about. We hear about other issues that are that are making it possible for foreign influence to potentially happen. So I think to be able to give a legal basis to it's not like political parties are saying, yeah, we'd love to have someone come and influence. It's not that. Parties have rules about who can participate in these. You have to be a member of the party, obviously, and you all know this better than me. But giving Elections Canada the ability to go after someone who has violated this law, that's important.
I'll have to cut you off there. My apologies. I will go to Mr. Cooper and Madame Briere next. I will warn you in advance. I will cut you off at 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Turnbull, we heard from the Chief Electoral Officer in the previous hour who acknowledged that there are no real safeguards to prevent foreign actors from exploiting the exception with respect to third-party financing, where third parties could use their own funds in terms of purchasing goods or services or funneling money into those entities that could then be used for regulated activities by third parties. It's a loophole. You called it a loophole. I agree. It's certainly a loophole. You, in answer to Mr. Jackson, said that a solution would be some sort of separation of funds or separate accounting. Could you elaborate on what fix could be made to close that loophole as best as possible?
The only thing I can think of is for third parties. You're registered as the third party. You have to make representation to Elections Canada already. You're part of the system. As acknowledged as a third party, you have requirements under that. If you kept foreign funds completely separate, however they're coming, for whatever reason they're coming, right? If it's for a service, if it's whatever it is, if you keep the foreign funds separate from domestic funds, then when you get to the point of spending for regulated activities, you know that the money is only coming from money that you receive domestically, and you're subject to audit. So, and if the punishment's bad enough, it would discourage from doing it.
Well, why not simply require third parties to set up a separate bank account and use funds from that bank account from donations from individual Canadians for regulated activities? Why not simply do that? I mean, this bill largely does that, but it provides, well, it seeks to do that. There's this big loophole that makes it very, very easy to get around.
I agree with you. Okay. In my view, I don't think that would create an onerous responsibility on the part of third parties, even small ones.
Thank you for that. Mr. Burton, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm with you on this. I think it's a issue which should be addressed by amendments made by this committee.
And you think that this is the type of loophole that the United Front Work Department and the PRC would exploit?
Definitely. I mean, they look for any loophole and opportunity to exploit our freedom, our free and open system to further Chinese interests in Canada. And they have such a big operation and so much coordination and so much capacity that there's no loophole that they're not going to be going through, frankly, based on my 50 years of experience dealing with that regime.
Okay. Mr. Burton, I want to follow up with you from your opening statement regarding the Foreign Influence Registry. You noted that it's been 2 years since legislation was passed. 2 years later, we don't have the registry up and running. Are you concerned that the government is dragging its feet? And secondly, are you concerned about the independence of the commissioner and the impact that will have on the effectiveness of the registry once it is fully up and running?
Yes, I am concerned about the role of the civil servant who has been designated the foreign interference coordinator, that's Sébastien Aubin-Giguère, whether he would, in effect, be preventing Anton Bookman, who is been appointed the commissioner, from acting independently. And Mr. Bookman's office has been not very well funded. So I am concerned about whether the government genuinely wants a robust and effective foreign influence registry that's independent from the ministry and the Prime Minister's office.
10 seconds. Okay. Thank you so much. Madame Brière, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et j'aimerais.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask the same question that was asked during the first hour, the question that was asked to Professor Lala about the 10%. We heard the answer from the Chief Electoral Officer, and we just heard the exchange between Mr. Cooper and Madame Turnbull. So, Madame Lawler, Professor Lawler, what's your view on this?
There's no perfect political finance regime that absolutely prevents the interference of foreign monies into the Canadian political process. As I believe the CEO said this morning, we are always looking for a balance between not sort of encouraging political chill in the environment of political communications on behalf of political actors. On the other hand, we want to ensure, and I think Canadians feel very strongly about making sure foreign money doesn't enter our election in any meaningful way that could impact outcomes or even impact individual vote calculus. So creating this balance is very much a difficult legislative task. The 10% own funds may still invite mechanisms or ways in which foreign money could, in a very indirect way, enter into it. It doesn't completely exclude that possibility, but in tandem with other pieces of elections legislation, like regulated spending limits, we see the ways in which government has ensured that this sort of influence could only go so far. So the 10% provision needs to be read with the other elements of election law to determine the extent to which it can prevent that sort of foreign interference. It may be imperfect, but it may create some of that balance in allowing political expression for actors such as unions, corporations who have otherwise, and I think quite rightfully, been prevented from making monetary contributions in other ways.
Merci beaucoup. On sait que
Thank you. Do you think our system is solid and that it's important for the transparency of the electoral process? Do you think that what's in the provisions of C25 ensure that this transparency is maintained and the robustness of our election financing is maintained?
I do believe that the transparency provisions that exist within the bill to ensure that third parties identify the source of the funds are a step forward. Once again, I do not want to say that there is no way in which, and I think my colleagues, Dr. Turnbull and Mr. Burton, pointed out that money could still not be shuttled through, but I also struggle to think of a way in which political finance regimes exist where there is not always some backdoor. So I don't want to suggest that simply by removing the 10% own funds contribution that it is sort of fait accompli and we've solved political finance. I do think that there is value in having political expression from different actors in the political environment. I would suggest that the previous legislative change under successive Liberal and Conservative governments that have restricted campaign spending and have put limits on fundraising also go a good part of the way to preventing foreign influence. What I would say is that this is very much an iterative process, and so that if this provision does go through as it is currently written, we will see in the next election cycle or two just how effective it is and how that also affects the number and type of third parties that will participate in Canadian federal elections.
Et est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec le fait qu'on
And you
étend...
agree with extending measures to include nomination and leadership contests?
Yes, I do believe that this has been a neglected area of Canadian political finance law, and that bringing in nomination contests and leadership contests is a very important next step in making sure that Canadians can trust the different stages of the electoral process. While we have had some transparency and auditing that takes place via Elections Canada, I do think that this act does push that in the right direction by bringing those two types of competitions, even though they are the competitions that happen at the sort of level of the private organization of a political party. I do think that they will enhance public confidence in our election processes.
Thank you so much. You have 10 seconds. Excellent. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today. La réunion est adjournée.